Welcome to the Midnight Law channel. Imagine for a moment the world as it once was. A world before nation-states, before the steam engine, before even the idea of global empires had fully taken shape. Picture instead the cold, windswept coasts of northern Europe in the early Middle Ages, where the sea was both a lifeline and a looming threat, and where the rhythms of life rose and fell with the tides. It is twilight on the Baltic Sea, the hour when the day exhales its last breath and the night begins to gather itself. A thin mist drifts across the water, blurring the horizon, turning ships into silhouettes and shorelines into shadows. In the distance, the faint glow of lanterns sways on the decks of merchant vessels, their warm light flickering against the darkening waves. The evening air carries the scent of salt and tar, of wet timber and cool stone, the ancient perfume of northern harbours. Along the narrow waterfront streets of towns that were little more than wooden markets and quiet chapels, the last embers of daylight soften the outlines of gabled roofs and crooked warehouses. Fishermen coil their ropes for the night. Travellers reach for cloaks as the cold settles in. And in the great silence that follows the fading bustle of the day, you can almost hear the gentle creaking of moored ships, rocking patiently against the tide. This northern world, with its long winters and brief, brilliant summers, felt vast and uncertain to the people who lived within it. Beyond the familiar harbour walls stretched dark forests, unexplored rivers, and coastlines that could take weeks to follow. And out on the open water, a ship could vanish for days into storms or fog, its crew trusting only in the stars above and the strength of their vessel below. Yet it was from this quiet, shadowed world that one of history's most remarkable societies would emerge. Not an empire forged by kings or armies, but a brotherhood of merchants bound by trust, by commerce, and by the shared desire to survive the unpredictable northern seas. Their story begins not with conquest, but with cooperation, not with a crown, but with a compass, and not with the ambition to rule, but with the simple need to trade, to travel, and to thrive. Tonight, we step gently into that world, into the fog-lit harbours and timbered alleyways where it all began, into a realm shaped not by war, but by water, not by empires, but by tides. Into the story of the Hanseatic League. Let us begin, long before the Hanseatic League took shape, before its merchants stitched together the coasts of northern Europe with quiet but unbreakable threads of trade. The Baltic world was a patchwork of peoples, forests, rivers and shorelines that felt both ancient and untouched. It was a region defined by nature more than by nations, a place where power rose and fell like the tide, and where human settlements clung to the edges of vast wilderness. Imagine those early centuries. The Baltic Sea was not yet a crossroads of commerce, but a restless body of water bordered by lands that were still young in the eyes of medieval chroniclers. Deep pine forests stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by clearings where small communities lived in clusters of timber houses. Rivers wound like silver threads through untouched valleys, carrying traders and travellers from one quiet settlement to another. On calm mornings, you could watch the surface of a lake reflect the sky so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Different tribes and cultures lived across these lands. The Slavs to the south, the Finnic peoples to the north, the Baltic tribes along the eastern shores, and the Germanic peoples slowly moving eastward. Each had their own way of life, their own beliefs and their own traditions, but they shared one constant: the presence of the sea. The Baltic was unpredictable, but also generous. It offered fish, access to distant shores, and a highway for those bold enough to ride its winds. In these early centuries, trade was simple but essential. Villagers bartered furs for salt, amber for tools, honey for metal. A farmer might trade a single pelt for enough grain to last him through winter. A fisherman might exchange dried fish for a knife or a small iron nail. These exchanges took place in open fields, along riverbanks, or in small wooden markets that appeared during seasonal gatherings. They were local, fragile, and personal. Nothing yet resembling the vast systems that would come later. Still, faint hints of a larger world occasionally drifted into these northern ports. A rare coin from the distant Mediterranean. A story of far-off merchants seen beyond the horizon. A glimpse of silver ornaments that had journeyed from one end of Europe to the other. Many of these early influences came through the lingering memory of the Vikings, whose longships had once carved bright paths across the Baltic and beyond. Though their era of raiding and seafaring had diminished, the routes they charted remained, like ghostly corridors across the water. The maps that medieval sailors used were filled with the echoes of these earlier voyages. River crossings, portages, winter camps, all quietly shaping the movement of goods for centuries. Cities as we know them were still rare. Instead, the early Baltic was dotted with fortified hill settlements, wooden stockades, and modest market towns. Some of these would one day become key Hanseatic centres, but for now they were humble, hopeful beginnings. These early towns were places where smoke curled from hearths in the cold mornings, where traders gathered around tables full of animal hides and fish traps, and where foreign visitors were met with equal parts curiosity and caution. The people of this land lived with a deep awareness of the seasons. Winter came early and stayed late. Snow swept across the plains and forests, covering everything in a quiet, shimmering stillness. Rivers froze, turning travel routes into solid pathways until the spring thaw. Summer was brief but bright, with long days and wide open skies that encouraged movement, fishing, and trade. Autumn brought a wave of preparation, salting fish, storing grain, repairing roofs before the cold returned. In this slow rhythm, in this balance between hardship and opportunity, the foundations for something new were forming. Not through sudden change, but through repeated encounters. Traders returned to the same villages year after year. Familiar faces appeared at seasonal markets. Knowledge of distant shores spread from one community to the next. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Baltic began to weave itself together. It would still be many generations before the Hanseatic League emerged, but the world it would inherit, a world of scattered peoples, quiet ports, fragile alliances, and the ever-present sea, was already taking shape. It was a world waiting for connection, for structure, for a unifying force that could turn countless small exchanges into something steady, lasting, and powerful. And in time, that force would come. If the Baltic world before the Hanseatic League was a tapestry of scattered settlements and quiet trade routes, then Lubeck was the thread that first began to bind that tapestry together. In the early Middle Ages, long before it became known as the Queen of the Hanse, Lubeck was little more than a modest settlement pressed between rivers and forests. But its location, tucked neatly between the Baltic Sea and the inland waterways that led westward toward the North Sea, made it a place where paths converged, even when its people did not yet realize the significance of the ground beneath their feet. Imagine Lubeck in those early centuries. Not the grand brick city of later centuries, but a simpler, quieter place. A handful of wooden houses with thatched roofs clustered around the marketplace. Smoke rising from cooking fires. A few fishing boats pulled up on muddy banks. Narrow footpaths winding between marshland and wooded hills. The sound of axes echoing through distant forests as settlers carved out new homes among the trees. This early Lubeck lay along an ancient overland route known to merchants, pilgrims, and travellers alike. It was a gateway between two worlds, the wide, cold waters of the Baltic to the east, and the river networks that led inland and eventually toward Hamburg and beyond. Even when modest, this small settlement held the promise of movement, of exchange, of possibility. The first attempt to build a town here came from Slavic inhabitants who recognized the strategic nature of its terrain. But the settlement was destroyed during conflict, leaving the land quiet again for a time. Then, in the mid-12th century, a new effort took shape, this time led by German settlers under the guidance of Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria. They saw not just the land, but the future painted across its geography. They saw the opportunity to establish a permanent foothold for German merchants on the Baltic coast. So Lubeck rose once more, rebuilt with greater intention. Wooden streets gave way to more durable structures. Churches were erected, and their bells began to shape the rhythm of daily life. Merchants arrived from Saxony, from Westphalia, from the Rhineland. They brought with them not just goods, but customs, laws, and the seeds of a new commercial order. In the early sunlight, Lubeck's harbour would have been a scene of quiet industry. Ships with round hulls and single masts, early cogs, resting at anchor, their sails rolled tight. Dock workers stacking barrels of salt, timber and grain. Fishermen mending nets while calling out to familiar faces. The scent of fresh bread drifting from roadside ovens as the town slowly woke. These simple, steady scenes were what gave Lubeck its soul, not grandeur, but rhythm. It was a town built on the quiet confidence that trade would grow year by year, journey by journey. Merchants recorded their dealings carefully in ink-stained ledgers. Local craftsmen shaped tools and timbers to support the growing shipyards. Visitors from distant shores noticed something different here. An energy, a coherence, a sense that this place understood its purpose. Lubeck's real advantage, though, was not merely its location or its reconstruction. It was its approach to law and administration. The town adopted its own legal code, Lubeck law, which standardized trade practices, protected merchants, and encouraged settlement. It emphasized property rights, fair courts, and commercial stability. In an age when many towns lived at the mercy of volatile rulers or local warlords, Lubeck offered something precious: predictability. Predictability brought merchants, merchants brought wealth, wealth brought influence, and influence slowly and steadily set Lubeck apart. By the late 12th century, Lubeck was no longer a quiet outpost on the Baltic. It had become a rising power, a beacon for traders seeking a safe harbour, a centre for negotiations, a place where deals were struck and alliances formed. Its streets grew busier, its wharves fuller, its warehouses taller. The sound of foreign languages became more common: Low German, Danish, Swedish, Polish, and the soft Slavic dialects of the Baltic coasts. Lubeck was still young, but its character was already unmistakable. It was not a city of kings or soldiers. It was a city of merchants, steady-handed, forward-looking, and quietly ambitious. And in these merchants, in their shared values and mutual trust, lay the first true spark of what would one day become the Hanseatic League. For now, though, Lubeck simply felt like a place on the verge of becoming something greater. A place where dawn seemed to linger a little longer each morning, where opportunity seemed to drift in on the tide, where the people sensed, even if they could not yet name it, that their city stood at the beginning of a journey that would change the history of Northern Europe. And as the years passed, that journey would begin to spread outward, following the coastline, touching distant towns, and shaping an alliance that would endure for centuries. As Lubeck settled into its new identity as a rising Baltic port, a quieter transformation began to shape its future, one that unfolded not through grand events or sudden declarations, but through the daily work of merchants, craftsmen, and travellers who moved quietly through its streets. For it was the merchants themselves, far more than dukes or bishops, who would lay the foundations of a league that stretched across the northern world. To understand this transformation, you must picture the life of a medieval merchant, not the wealthy figure of later centuries, but the early trader, cautious, deliberate, and always watching the horizon. A man who spent long months away from home, following the uncertain routes between harbours, rivers, and inland markets. His world was one of ledgers and negotiations, but also storms, bandits, and the unpredictable temper of the sea. These merchants lived by their wits as much as by their courage. They walked the narrow line between risk and reward, never fully certain which would greet them at their next port. A sudden gale could scatter their cargo across the waves. A dispute in a foreign town could cost them everything. And yet, year after year they continued, drawn onward by opportunity, by necessity, and by the quiet hope of prosperity. In the early days of Lubeck, these merchants came from many regions and backgrounds, but they shared similar experiences. They knew the loneliness of coastal nights, the cold spray of early morning departures, and the faint relief of seeing the familiar outline of a friendly port after long weeks at sea. They also knew the frustration of inconsistent rules, unfamiliar customs, and the dangers that waited whenever they travelled alone. To face these challenges, merchants began to do what humans have always done when confronted with uncertainty. They banded together. At first, this union was informal, small groups of traders who agreed to travel together for safety. A single ship might carry goods for several merchants, while others sailed in convoy, believing that a fleet was less likely to be attacked than a solitary vessel. Merchants shared news about safe harbours, fair judges, and reliable markets. They shared warnings too, of storms, toll collectors, and regions to avoid. As this sense of mutual reliance grew, it began to take on structure. Guilds formed within towns, binding traders together by oath and purpose. These guilds weren't simply economic partnerships, they were communities. Their members promised to support one another, to uphold fair standards, and to defend their collective interests. In a world where a single dishonest official could ruin a man's livelihood, solidarity was everything. Picture a guild hall in early Lübeck or Hamburg, a sturdy wooden building near the marketplace, warmed by the glow of lanterns. Inside, long tables are set with ledgers, maps, and cups of ale. Men gather to discuss their journeys, their grievances, their ambitions. Some are young, eager to set sail for the first time. Others are seasoned traders with faces weathered by wind and salt. Together, they debate prices, agree on trading rules, and decide how best to protect their members in foreign towns. The guild system gave merchants a voice, not just at home, but abroad. As guilds grew in strength, they began to send representatives to foreign ports, securing rights and privileges for their members. These privileges varied from town to town: exemption from certain tolls, protection under local law, or the right to maintain their own warehouses. But everywhere they went, guilds sought to ensure that their merchants were treated fairly. This network of mutual agreements grew slowly but steadily. Through guilds, merchants began to feel a sense of belonging that transcended their individual town or region. They recognized their shared identity as traders of the North, men united by common challenges, common values, and common ambitions. It was this shared identity that would eventually form the invisible backbone of the Hanseatic League. Yet at this early stage, nothing was formally declared. There was no charter, no grand proclamation. No one stood atop a tower to announce the birth of a new commercial confederation. Instead, the League began as all enduring things do, quietly, in the corners of guild halls, in the negotiations between travellers, in the recognition that no merchant prospers alone. The early Hansa, a word that meant simply a group or a convoy, was at first just that, a gathering of merchants who trusted one another. But trust, once established, has a way of growing roots. Over time, these roots intertwined, connecting city to city, port to port, until the entire Baltic world was tied together by a web of relationships stronger than any one man, any one ship, or any one storm. And in this growing network, fragile, informal, but undeniably real, the first outlines of the Hanseatic League began to emerge. A league without borders, without armies, and without a king. A league shaped not by force, but by trade, by cooperation, and by the quiet determination of those who made their living on the northern seas. As the years passed, this network would expand beyond Lubeck's modest harbour, reaching toward the east, touching forests and rivers and ancient princely courts. The Baltic world was awakening, and its towns were beginning to stir with ambition. Before long, Lubeck would no longer be alone. As Lubeck grew from a promising settlement into a confident port, its influence began to ripple outward across the Baltic Sea. But Lubeck did not rise alone. All along the cold northern coast, other towns were awakening in their own quiet ways. Places that had stood for centuries as modest trading posts, fortified hill settlements, or riverside markets, now poised to become part of something larger. The Baltic, once a vast and uncertain frontier, was beginning to feel connected, slowly, gradually, like dawn spreading across the horizon. Imagine the sea as it would have appeared to a merchant sailing eastward from Lubeck in the early Middle Ages, a rolling expanse of grey and silver, dotted with islands and rocky outcroppings, gulls circling overhead, the faint outline of distant pines visible in the morning light, the wind sharp and clean, carrying the scent of resin from forests that seemed endless. As a ship pushed deeper into the Baltic, it would approach ancient towns that predated the League's rise, each one a world of its own, with its own customs, its own streets, and its own rhythms. And yet, each one shared a simple truth. They all depended on the sea. The first great jewel on this eastern journey was Visby, on the island of Gotland. Long before the Hanseatic League took shape, Visby was already a thriving commercial centre. It sat like a stepping stone between Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and the wider world. Its town walls would come later, but even in its early days, Visby carried an unmistakable air of importance. Picture its harbour, curved like a crescent, hugging the shore. Ships from every corner of the Baltic anchored there, longboats from Sweden, cargo vessels from German ports, traders from as far south as Lubeck. The quays were busy even at dawn, lined with barrels of smoked herring, stacks of timber, and bundles of wool from inland farms. Walk a little further into Visby, and you would find narrow streets of timber houses, sturdy warehouses, and small taverns filled with the crackle of fire and the murmur of travellers exchanging stories. The air carried a mixture of salt, fish, and spices brought from distant markets. At night, lanterns flickered against stone walls, and the hum of conversation softened as weary sailors drifted to sleep. Visby was already a crossroads, but the coming of Lubeck's merchants and the shared rules they brought would knit it firmly into a rising network. Further along the coast lay Riga, a city built where the river Daugava meets the Baltic. The river was Riga's heartbeat. It stretched deep into the forests of Livonia, connecting inland settlements to the sea. Traders floated timber and furs downriver on wooden rafts, guiding them carefully around bends and through calm stretches of water. By the time they reached Riga's harbour, they had travelled days, sometimes weeks. Riga had a character shaped by its geography, quiet confidence, steady growth, and a blending of cultures. German settlers lived alongside local Baltic peoples, forming a town where languages mixed as easily as goods. In the markets, you might see bolts of cloth from the Low Countries, barrels of salt from the coast, and tall stacks of fine, pale timber ready to be loaded onto ships bound for the west. The gentle hum of the city rose and fell like a tide. Blacksmiths at their forges, merchants tallying goods by candlelight, fishermen returning in the grey early mornings. Riga would become one of the League's most important hubs, but for now it was simply growing, quietly and steadily. Moving south along the coastline, the shipyards and markets of Danzig, known today as Gdansk, waited at the mouth of the Vistula River. Here, the river opened into a wide estuary, carrying grain, amber, honey, and timber from deep within Poland and beyond. Danzig was blessed by geography. It was the final stop for goods travelling along the Vistula, and the first major Baltic port for traders arriving from Germany, Scandinavia, or the Low Countries. Danzig's harbour bustled with activity. Massive grain warehouses lined the riverbanks, their doors thrown wide as sacks were carried in and out. Shipbuilders hammered planks into sturdy hulls. Barges slid slowly across the water, guided by poles and ropes. The city seemed to breathe, inhaling goods from inland and exhaling ships heavy with cargo bound for distant shores. Then there was Reval, the medieval name for Tallinn. Tallinn rose from the northern coast like a fortress, its stone walls and steep streets contrasting sharply with the flat lands around it. Perched on a hill overlooking the sea, its towers provided a view of the ships approaching from afar. The town was colder, harsher, more austere than some of its western sisters, shaped by the long winters and winds that swept across its high walls. But Reval held something precious, certainty, a safe harbour for merchants coming from the Finnish Gulf, a stronghold where commerce and protection went hand in hand, a place where wooden piers reached into icy water like outstretched fingers. Across the sea, in these towns and many others, Riga, Danzig, Visby, Reval, a subtle pattern was beginning to appear. Nearly all were old places with local identities and long histories, but they shared something new. Growing contact with Lubeck and the merchants who carried Lubeck's laws, customs, and trading practices with them. None of these towns had yet signed anything. No formal league existed, but the idea of a shared commercial world, one where a merchant from Lubeck could expect fair treatment in Riga, or where a trader from Danzig could rely on protection in Visby, was beginning to take root. And in the centuries to come, these towns would become pillars of a maritime network unlike anything Northern Europe had ever seen. A network built on trust, on mutual benefit, and on the gentle but persistent pull of the sea. As the merchant fleets moved between them, sailing past islands, skirting dangerous shoals, and following the familiar constellations, the Baltic itself became a bridge, a cold, restless, beautiful bridge connecting people, languages, and livelihoods. The Hanseatic world was forming, piece by piece, and its merchants were already dreaming of what might come next. To understand how the Hanseatic League knitted the coasts of Northern Europe into a single commercial world, you must first understand the vessel that carried its ambitions, a simple, sturdy ship known as the cog. It was not elegant like the sleek Mediterranean galleys, nor swift like the Viking longships of earlier centuries. It was a vessel built not for conquest or speed, but for endurance, stability, and the steady, patient movement of goods across the ever-changing Baltic Sea. Imagine standing on a quiet shoreline in the 13th century, watching a cog glide slowly toward harbour as twilight settles over the water. The ship approaches broadside first, its round, full hull dipping gently with the tide. Its single mast rises against the fading sky, supporting a thick, square sail that hangs loosely now, like a great canvas curtain softened by the evening breeze. The hull is dark from fresh tar, the smell of pine resin still clinging to its planks. Lanterns sway from the stern, their warm light reflecting in long, trembling lines across the water. The cog looked modest, almost plain, but in its simplicity lay its strength. Constructed from oak, dense, durable, and abundant in the forests of northern Germany and Scandinavia, the cog was built for a world of shallow coasts and unpredictable winds. Its flat bottom allowed it to approach beaches and river mouths that deeper ships could not reach. Its high sides protected cargo from waves and offered shelter to its crew, and its wide belly allowed it to carry more than almost any other vessel of its size. Step closer, and the details come into view. Thick wooden planks overlapping in the clinker-built style. Iron spikes hammered deep into the hull. A raised platform at the stern where the captain stood watch. A rudder set on a heavy hinge, controlled by a long tiller. Everything about the design was practical. Everything had a purpose. To sail on a cog was to surrender yourself to a slower, steadier rhythm than the longships of centuries before. A cog did not slice through water. It shouldered its way forward, the great sail catching winds that carried it across the Baltic in a series of long, deliberate movements. It was built not for sudden bursts of speed, but for endurance. A cog could travel for weeks, its hold filled with salt, wax, timber, herring, grain, furs, or cloth, the lifeblood of the Hanseatic world. Life aboard moved at a gentle pace. At dawn, the crew would rise to the soft grey light spreading over the water. They moved quietly across the deck, checking ropes and inspecting the sail. The smell of porridge warmed over a small stove drifted into the morning air. The captain noted the day's course in a worn ledger, while the sailors scanned the horizon for familiar landmarks. A distant headland, a cluster of rocks, the faint outline of a watchtower. The sea dictated everything. If the wind was strong, the cog pressed forward, the sail billowing like a living thing. If the wind faltered, the ship drifted calmly, waiting for its return. And if a storm gathered, which it often did in these northern waters, the crew prepared to ride it out with patience, trusting in the heavy hull beneath their feet. In the evenings, when the sea darkened and the sky filled with cold stars, the crew gathered at the stern, speaking quietly of home, of markets, of future voyages. They ate salted fish and coarse bread by lantern light. The ship creaked gently as it rocked, the sound steady and reassuring, the heartbeat of a vessel built to endure. The cog was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of a new kind of world. Before the cog, northern trade had relied on small, shallow craft that could not carry large cargoes. Routes were limited. Markets were modest. Exchange was local. But with the arrival of the cog, sturdy, capacious, reliable, everything changed. Now goods could be moved not just from village to village, but from region to region, from coast to coast, in quantities large enough to transform economies. A single cog could carry dozens of tons of cargo. A small fleet could supply an entire region. And dozens of fleets, sailing month after month, could bind cities together in a web of commerce that made distance feel smaller, seasons feel more predictable, and opportunities feel closer than ever before. It is no exaggeration to say that the cog was the foundation upon which the Hanseatic League was built. Without it, the League's sprawling network of ports would have remained isolated, separated by the difficulties of travel. Without it, the trade routes between Lubeck, Riga, Danzig, Visby and beyond would have been thin and fragile. But the cog was steady, dependable and humble, a quiet workhorse of the sea that made possible the rise of a commercial empire. For many centuries, these ships dotted the Baltic, like small islands of light in the long northern nights, carrying goods, hopes, and the shared dreams of merchants who trusted one another across borders and languages. They were not grand warships or majestic galleons. They were ordinary vessels doing extraordinary work. And it was through their slow, deliberate journeys, over cold waters, through unpredictable winds, that the Hanseatic world expanded further eastward, reaching into the great forests, rivers, and distant realms of northern Europe. Beyond the Baltic's edge lay a land of deep snow and ancient cities, where the League's merchants would soon find one of their most important partners and most delicate challenges. Sailing eastward across the wide sweep of the Baltic, past rocky islands and windswept capes, the sea gradually narrows into long, quiet gulfs where the winds soften and the water grows calmer. The landscape changes here. The coastline becomes wilder, the forest darker and thicker, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Even the light feels different, pale in winter, golden in summer, always filtered through a thin veil of northern mist. This was the route to Novgorod, the farthest frontier of the Hanseatic world, a city wrapped in legend, even in its own time. To reach it, a merchant ship would leave the open Baltic for the Gulf of Finland, then continue onward toward the great rivers that carried trade deep into the Slavic lands. The sea gave way to calmer waters, then to long, winding channels, where the only sounds were the splash of oars and the distant calls of forest birds. Novgorod did not rise from coastal cliffs or island harbours like other Hanseatic towns. It emerged instead from the forests, old, sprawling, and deeply rooted in its land. By the time Hanseatic traders arrived, it was already one of the most important cities in the region, a place where merchants from the north, south, east, and west exchanged goods in a bustling, ancient marketplace. Imagine approaching Novgorod for the first time. Instead of salt air, you would smell pine and damp earth. Instead of gulls, you would hear the rhythmic chopping of wood or the distant toll of bells from the city's wooden towers. Instead of the open sky over the Baltic, you would find the world narrowing into a great river leading toward a city of timber walls and broad marketplaces. Novgorod's architecture reflected its surroundings: tall wooden ramparts, steep-roofed houses, and churches crowned with onion domes that rose like soft silver shapes above the treetops. In the warm months, boats crowded along the riverbanks, their hulls filled with furs, wax, honey, flax, and other treasures drawn from the vast wilderness that stretched far to the north. In the winter, when the river froze and travel slowed, the city fell into a deep, quiet stillness, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath the boots of traders and the muffled sounds of market halls. The heart of Hanseatic life in Novgorod was the Peterhof, a fortified trading yard near the river. It was not a grand palace or a monumental building, but a practical compound where German merchants lived, worked, and stored their goods. High wooden walls protected it from the outside, while inside, warehouses lined narrow courtyards filled with sledges, barrels, and workers moving steadily from place to place. The merchants who lived in the Peterhof observed strict routines. They rose early, prayed together, kept meticulous accounts, and adhered to rules set by Lubeck and other Hanse authorities. They lived as a community, eating in communal halls, sharing news of the markets, discussing prices and routes, and preparing for the long journeys back toward the Baltic. Despite the distance from home, the atmosphere inside the Peterhof was familiar to any Hanseatic trader: the smell of ink and parchment, the soft murmur of ledgers being read aloud, the clatter of goods being weighed and recorded, the warmth of a shared fire in the evenings when stories softened and voices grew tired. Outside the walls, Novgorod offered a world rich in culture and tradition. Local traders spoke a Slavic tongue, wore long fur-lined coats, and carried themselves with quiet confidence. Their customs were shaped by centuries of forest life, seasonal hunting, river travel, and a deep connection to the land. Orthodox churches with painted icons filled the city squares, their interiors glowing with candlelight in the long, dark winters. Festivals were held in the spring, markets thrived in the summer, and the entire city gathered for trade fairs that drew people from as far as the steppe and the Arctic Circle. Trade between the Hansa and Novgorod was built on delicate balance. Novgorod held the key to northern resources, the finest furs, beeswax, timber, and rare goods gathered from deep forests and distant frontiers. The Hansa brought Western textiles, metal goods, salt, and luxury items unavailable in the East. Both sides depended on each other, though neither wished to surrender too much ground. For German merchants, Novgorod was a land of opportunity, but also of caution. They were guests in a powerful, independent city-state ruled by a Veche, a popular assembly, and supported by wealthy boyars. Their privilege to trade here relied on diplomacy and good conduct. A wrong gesture, a misunderstood bargain, or a moment of arrogance could lead to expulsion. There were winters when tensions strained, and years when foreign merchants were banned temporarily, forced to wait for political winds to shift. And yet, decade after decade, the relationship endured. News from Lubeck reached Novgorod through long, snowy trails. Goods from Novgorod travelled westwards by river and sea. Letters, sealed in wax, crossed the forests and waterways between distant cities, carrying instructions, warnings, and hopes for the spring season ahead. For the Hanseatic League, Novgorod represented the very edge of their world, a reminder that commerce could cross borders that armies could not. It was a place where two worlds met gently, not in conquest, but in trade, where German merchants lived within Russian walls and Russian goods travelled across German seas. In the stillness of a Novgorod winter night, with snow falling in soft, steady sheets, and the lights of the Peterhof flickering behind wooden shutters, you can imagine those early Hanseatic merchants thinking of home, of Lubeck's harbour, of the Baltic tides, of the quiet routes that had brought them here. And you can imagine them knowing just as clearly that this distant city was essential to their league's growing power. The road to the east had been opened, and now the merchants of the Hansa would turn their eyes westward again, toward the distant markets of Flanders, England, and the North Sea. From the forests and river paths of Novgorod, the Hanseatic merchants would eventually turn their gaze westward again, leaving behind the quiet snowfields and timbered halls of the east. Their ships retraced the long journey back through the Baltic, past the rocky coasts of Finland, the islands of Sweden, and the windswept shores of Denmark. They followed the same familiar constellations that had guided seafarers for generations, until the narrow waters opened into the broader sweep of the North Sea. Here, the world changed once more. The air smelled of salt and open ocean. The winds were stronger, colder, unpredictable. The sea expanded endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by the shadows of passing ships and the occasional cry of seabirds carried over vast distances. Beyond these restless waters lay two of the most important destinations in the Hanseatic network, Bruges and London, places where the goods of Northern Europe met the luxuries and industries of the West, places where cultures mingled, languages blended, and commerce took on a richness that shaped entire regions. Imagine approaching Bruges in its medieval prime, not as the quiet, picturesque city it is today, but as one of the busiest ports in Europe. The sea reached closer then, the Zwin Inlet connecting Bruges directly to the North Sea. Ships entered along a winding waterway, flanked by marshy meadows, finally reaching a harbour alive with activity. Here, the Hanseatic presence was unmistakable. Warehouses lined the quays, built with sturdy timber frames and high roofs to store goods brought from distant coasts. Merchants from Lubeck, Hamburg, and Danzig walked the cobbled streets alongside Flemish weavers, Italian bankers, and English traders. The city's markets were filled with cloth, dyed in brilliant colours, barrels of French wine, delicate glassware from Venice, and spices from the far reaches of the Mediterranean. Bruges exuded a sense of cosmopolitan life. Its canals reflected the warm glow of lanterns at dusk. Church bells rang across narrow streets where craftsmen and travellers crossed paths. In guild halls lit by flickering candles, merchants discussed prices, resolved disputes, and planned their next journeys across the sea. For Hanseatic traders, Bruges was a place of opportunity, a gateway to European luxury markets, a hub where northern resources met southern refinement. Here they sold grain, wax, furs, timber, and fish, exchanging them for fine cloth, metalware, and goods they carried back across the Baltic. The rhythm of trade was steady, respectful, and deeply woven into the city's life. And yet, Bruges was only one of the League's western strongholds. Further along the coast, across the choppy waters of the Channel, lay London, a city older than memory, a place of sprawling markets and powerful guilds, built along the banks of the River Thames. Imagine arriving in medieval London by ship. The Thames is wide here, flowing steadily under the weight of centuries. The river smells of salt, silt, and the smoke drifting from hearths in the city beyond. As the tide carries the ship inland, wooden docks rise into view, long piers crowded with sailors, carts and labourers. Warehouses line the waterfront, their doors thrown open to receive the endless stream of goods. The Hanseatic merchants who traded in London were welcomed, tolerated, or resented depending on the season, the politics, and the mood of the city's rulers. But they always had a home here, a walled enclave known as the Steel Yard. The Steel Yard was a world unto itself. Behind its gates lay warehouses, offices, living quarters, and a central courtyard where men gathered to discuss business in quiet voices. The merchants lived under their own regulations, kept their own books, and observed the customs of Lubeck and Hamburg, even while residing in the heart of England. German was spoken alongside English. Ledger books filled with neat handwriting recorded the flow of wool, cloth, metals, and grain. Letters from home arrived by ship, sealed in wax and carrying news of markets across the sea. Within the Steel Yard, life moved in a calm, predictable rhythm. The morning began with the soft shuffle of workers unloading cargo. The afternoons were filled with negotiations, visits from English guild leaders, and the steady scratching of quills on parchment. And in the evenings, amid the glow of lantern light, merchants gathered for warm meals and quiet conversation, discussing storms they had weathered at sea, the price of cloth in Flanders, or the uncertain politics of the day. Outside its walls, London was loud, crowded, and complex, a great urban tapestry of markets, inns, workshops, and winding streets. But the Steel Yard remained a place of order amid the noise. It was the Hanseatic League's anchor in the west, just as Novgorod had been its anchor in the east. And through Bruges and London, the League gained something invaluable, not just wealth, but influence, not just trade, but reach. Connections that spanned from the cold forests of Russia to the crowded markets of England. Through these western gateways, the Hansa tied itself firmly to Europe's economic pulse, weaving a network of trade that few kingdoms could match. But even as commerce flourished, life within the Hanseatic towns was changing too. Markets were growing, guilds were expanding, and the people who lived in these coastal cities were beginning to experience a new kind of prosperity. In our next chapter, we'll step away from the ships and the sea routes and walk quietly through the daily life of a Hanseatic town to understand the world these merchants were building, not just across the waters, but within the walls of their own homes. If the ships of the Hanseatic League were its beating heart, then its towns were the lungs that kept the entire body breathing, steady, rhythmic, and full of quiet life. To understand the world the Hansa created, you must picture a single Hanseatic town. not in a moment of ceremony or bustling trade, but in the soft, unremarkable hours of an ordinary day. For it was in these hours, in the warmth of workshops and the gentle hush of early mornings, that the fabric of Hanseatic society was woven. Imagine a typical town along the Baltic coast, perhaps Lübeck or Danzig or Riga, just as the first light of dawn begins to stretch across the rooftops. The sky is a pale, grey blue, the colour of morning fog before the sun takes hold. The air carries a faint chill, even in summer, drifting in from the sea and brushing gently against the timber frames of the houses lining the narrow streets. The town is quiet at this hour. A few early risers move through the marketplace, their footsteps soft on the cobblestones. A baker opens the shutters of his small shop, letting the aroma of warm dough spill into the street. A milkmaid walks slowly toward the central square, her pails swaying with each step. The distant sound of waves blends with the muffled clatter of carts being prepared for the day's work. Soon, the guilds awaken. Each craft, whether merchants, carpenters, weavers, brewers, or blacksmiths, has its own hall, a sturdy building often decorated with carved symbols of their trade. In these halls, members gather to discuss prices, maintain standards of workmanship, and settle disputes quietly, calmly, without the need for outside intervention. A guild was more than a professional association. It was a community, a safety net, a source of pride. The houses in a Hanseatic town were built tall and narrow, their gabled fronts facing the street like rows of watchful guardians. Many contained workshops on the ground floor, with living quarters above. It wasn't unusual to smell fresh timber shavings on one block, or the earthy scent of leather being worked on the next. The sounds of everyday life drifted from open doorways, hammers tapping steadily, looms clattering in rhythmic patterns, and voices murmuring softly as apprentices received instructions from their masters. A Hanseatic town moved at a measured, deliberate pace, not rushed, not chaotic, but orderly, structured, and deeply rooted in routine. Ships arrived with the tide, and the entire town seemed to sway with that rhythm. When a cog entered the harbour, bells might ring, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Dockworkers moved toward the piers, carrying ropes and long hooks. Merchants gathered near the waterfront to see which goods had arrived. Children ran along the docks, calling out greetings to familiar sailors, and above it all, the church bells chimed the hour, their echoes rolling gently over the rooftops and out toward the sea. In the streets behind the harbour, market stalls filled slowly. Fishmongers laid out their catch, placing each fish carefully on beds of crushed ice or cool river stones. Vendors sold bread, honey, salt, and herbs wrapped in cloth bundles. A travelling storyteller or musician might set up near the town well, offering tales from distant lands or songs carried across the water. Buyers wandered from stall to stall, speaking in Low German, Danish, Swedish, Polish, or whatever languages were common in that town. What made Hanseatic towns unique was their sense of familiarity. Despite differences in culture or design, a merchant arriving in Riga would feel something faintly similar to what he knew in Lubeck or Hamburg. The same measurements were used, the same trading customs applied. Contract forms, legal terms, and expectations were shared across borders. Even the layout of many towns, the marketplace at the centre, the church nearby, the merchant houses facing the streets, followed familiar patterns. This uniformity gave merchants a sense of belonging wherever they travelled, and it gave towns a sense of unity, even if no single ruler commanded them. In the evenings, as the day wound down, the mood of the town softened once more. Shops closed their shutters. Workers returned home, their hands rough from the day's labour. Lanterns flickered to life along the streets. The warm glow of hearth fires lit the windows of houses, casting long golden rectangles across the cobblestones. Families gathered for supper, Simple meals of bread, fish, and vegetables, sometimes accompanied by ale brewed in nearby workshops. Afterwards, people lingered by the fire, talking quietly or sitting in peaceful silence as the embers dimmed. On some nights, a gentle fog rolled in from the sea, enveloping the town in a soft, dreamlike stillness. The smell of salt and smoke hung in the air. Footsteps became muted. Even the dogs curled beside doorways fell silent as the mist settled. It was in these quiet evenings that Hanseatic towns felt most alive, not in their noise or their bustling markets, but in the calm that rested beneath it all, in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same familiar rhythms, the ships, the markets, the guilds, the workshops, a sense of continuity that stretched across generations. The Hanseatic League at its core was not built on grand battles or political declarations. It was built on mornings like these and evenings like these, repeated in dozens of towns across the Baltic and the North Sea. It was built on the quiet diligence of ordinary people, whose lives formed the foundation of something far larger than they ever imagined. And as these towns grew more prosperous, more connected, and more confident, they began to develop laws and systems that would bind them together even more firmly, rules that would shape the League for centuries to come. In the calm, predictable rhythm of a Hanseatic town, something subtle yet powerful lay beneath the surface, an invisible framework of rules and agreements that shaped every trade, every agreement, and every journey across the sea. These laws did not shimmer with the grandeur of royal decrees or the rigid clarity of imperial edicts. Instead, they grew out of practice, trust, and necessity, crafted patiently by merchants who understood that commerce only flourishes where fairness and predictability take root. At the centre of this system was Lubeck law, a model so influential that it spread like a steady tide across the Baltic world. Town after town, drawn by the promise of clear rules and equal treatment, adopted its principles. Lubeck law was not an expression of loyalty to a king. It was loyalty to a way of life, to a belief that order could emerge from cooperation rather than coercion. Imagine stepping inside a Hanseatic courtroom in one of these towns. The room is simple, wooden benches worn smooth by years of use, the faint scent of ink and parchment lingering in the air. At the front stands a long table where judges and elders confer, their expressions calm and measured. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, dust motes drifting in the beams. The room feels neither imposing nor intimidating. Rather, it carries an air of quiet professionalism, as if disputes here are not battles to be won, but problems to be solved. A merchant steps forward to present a complaint. Perhaps a shipment arrived damaged, or a partner failed to uphold an agreement. He speaks plainly, referring to entries in his ledger, which he places carefully on the table for all to see. Witnesses speak if needed, not with fervour or theatrics, but with a steady sense of responsibility. The judges listen, deliberate, and offer their ruling. There is no drama, no raised voices, only the steady pulse of fairness guiding the proceedings. This was the essence of Hanseatic law: clear expectations, honesty in trade, protection for all who participated in commerce. These principles allowed merchants to travel from one town to another with a sense of confidence rare in the medieval world. In an age when countless regions were governed by unpredictable lords or shifting customs, Hanseatic towns stood apart. Their laws were consistent, their courts reputable, their judgments respected across borders. One of the League's most significant innovations was its insistence on standardization. Weights and measures were uniform. Contracts followed familiar patterns. Even the size and volume of barrels were regulated to prevent fraud. A Hanseatic trader in Riga could purchase a barrel of fish knowing that it matched the same measure he used in Lubeck. A shipbuilder in Danzig could offer timber to merchants in Hamburg without needing to recalculate basic units. These small consistencies might seem mundane, but they formed the foundation of a prosperous and interconnected economy. Law and order extended beyond commerce, shaping social life as well. Guilds enforced apprenticeship standards, ensuring that young craftsmen received proper training and that their masters treated them fairly. Town councils regulated markets, controlled the quality of goods, and maintained peace within the walls. Even the streets themselves were watched over. Curfews were respected, marketplaces kept orderly, and harbour regulations strictly followed. In many towns, the night watch walked slowly along the narrow lanes, lanterns swinging gently at their sides. Their footsteps echoed off the timbered houses as they passed by, ensuring that fires were kept under control, that travellers found safe lodging, and that the calm of the night remained unbroken. The soft glow of their lanterns offered reassurance, a reminder that the town was not merely left to the darkness. The laws of the Hansa were not harsh or punitive. They were practical, shaped by the realities of life on the sea. They understood that a merchant's reputation was worth more than coin, that trust travelled farther than any ship, and that cooperation brought more prosperity than rivalry. For all their variety, Hanseatic towns shared this belief, and it bound them together more tightly than any army ever could. Communication kept this legal world aligned. Letters travelled across the Baltic, sealed in wax, carrying updates on rulings, amendments, and new statutes. Representatives from different towns met periodically to discuss legal matters, ensuring that no city drifted too far from the common code. Merchants arriving in a foreign port knew what to expect, not because they carried a royal decree, but because the unwritten bond of the League travelled with them. And yet, the Hansa's legal order was never rigid or authoritarian. It grew like a living organism, adjusting gently to new circumstances as trade expanded, as conflicts arose, and as towns joined the League. It adapted, refined itself, and absorbed new lessons, always with the quiet goal of maintaining stability across the waters. In the candlelit halls of town councils, in the quiet corners of guild rooms, and in the steady deliberations of courtroom benches, the League's legal spirit endured. It was a spirit born not of conquest, but of commerce, not of dominance, but of cooperation, not of power, but of peace. Through these laws, the Hanseatic League became more than a trading network. It became a community, one where the flicker of lanterns in a courtroom symbolized something rare in the medieval world, a shared belief in fairness. And with that fairness came something even more valuable: trust. A trust that would carry the League into its golden age, when its influence stretched across the entire northern world. By the time the 13th century settled into its middle decades, a transformation had taken place across the cold waters of the Baltic and the North Sea. It had not happened suddenly, nor through any single event that chroniclers could neatly record. Instead, it evolved the way winter yields to spring, gradually, steadily, so that only when one looked back did the scale of the change become clear. The traders of Lubeck, Hamburg, Riga, Danzig, Visby, and countless other ports had formed something far greater than the sum of their individual towns. They had created a network, an intricate living web of alliances, routes, customs, and trust that connected distant harbours as seamlessly as if they were different streets of the same sprawling city. And this network, though it had no king, no standing army, and no borders marked upon any map, had grown into a power that shaped the entire northern world. This was the Hanseatic League at its height. Imagine the Baltic Sea in these years. Its waters, once unpredictable and fragmented, now carried a steady procession of ships, broad-hulled cogs sailing in careful convoys, their square sails catching the wind in quiet harmony. From the deck of one of these ships, you might see others gliding along the horizon, their lanterns glowing softly at night as they travelled between the same trusted ports. Each vessel carried more than goods. It carried the invisible guarantees of Hanseatic cooperation, fair laws, predictable markets, and the expectation of safety in foreign harbours. For merchants, these were luxuries as precious as any cargo. In town after town, across the coasts of the Baltic and the North Sea, the influence of the League could be felt in the very shape of daily life. Cities expanded their harbours, built new storehouses, and widened their marketplaces. Brick Gothic architecture rose in elegant arches and tall red stone facades, symbols of prosperity and civic pride. Streets grew busier, workshops multiplied, bells rang more frequently over the rooftops. Lubeck, at the centre of it all, became something rare, a city so respected that its customs were adopted far beyond its walls. Its laws shaped regional justice. Its coinage influenced local economies. Its merchants held a quiet authority that even kings acknowledged. But Lubeck was not alone in its rise. Hamburg grew rich through river trade and access to the North Sea. Danzig became a giant of grain export, feeding much of northern Europe. Riga flourished as a bridge between east and west. Rivalries stood as the northern gate, watching over the Gulf of Finland. And Visby, old, weathered and proud, remained one of the League's great jewels. Together, these towns formed a chain that stretched farther than any medieval kingdom dared to imagine. Goods flowed from inland farms and forests to distant markets with a smoothness rare for the time. Beeswax from Novgorod lit candles in London. English wool warmed the citizens of Danzig. Beer from Hamburg travelled to the courts of Scandinavia. Salt from western mines preserved fish that later fed entire regions. Every link strengthened the whole. Yet the League's power did not lie in wealth alone. It lay in something subtler: influence. Kings and dukes, bishops and counts, they all relied on the League more than they wished to admit. The merchants controlled trade routes, they supplied armies with provisions, they financed construction projects, monasteries, and even political ambitions. They offered loans to rulers, negotiated tariffs, and shaped maritime policy. And they did so quietly, respectfully, without the triumphalism of conquerors. The Hanseatic League never sought to rule. Its ambition was stability, not dominion. Its triumphs were measured not in land, but in trust. A traveller walking through a Hanseatic city at dusk would feel this stability in the atmosphere. Taverns filled with soft conversation, markets wound down with the closing of wooden shutters. Harbour lights flickered against the water as cogs prepared for early departures. Churches glowed with candlelight during evening prayer. Everything moved with a sense of order, as though the town breathed in unison with the sea. Even the nights felt safer in a Hansa town. Watchmen patrolled the streets with lanterns. Harbour masters recorded the comings and goings of ships. Guild members shared responsibility for fairness and quality. Conflict within the walls was rare, and when it occurred, it was settled not with violence, but with calm deliberation. This was the League's golden age, a time when the northern world, often overlooked by southern chroniclers, became a centre of innovation, cooperation, and economic strength. Without battles or conquests, without thrones or crowns, the merchants of the Hansa had forged a maritime empire of their own design. From Russia's forests to England's markets, from Scandinavian fjords to German rivers, from the bustling quays of Bruges to the quiet docks of Tallinn. The Hanseatic League stood as a testament to what could be achieved not through force, but through unity. But even in these years of prosperity, influences beyond the horizon were beginning to shift. New powers were rising. New kings were asserting control. And the sea, as always, was changing its moods. The League's golden age would shine for many decades more. But already, faint shadows gathered at its edges. For all its confidence and quiet strength, the Hanseatic League did not exist in isolation. It flourished along coastlines ruled by kings, men whose ambitions, rivalries, and shifting alliances cast long, subtle ripples across the northern seas. In the centuries when the League reached its height, the kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway stood watch over the same waters, their thrones shaped by old traditions, coastal loyalties, and the harsh realities of life in the north. And though the League and these kingdoms shared the same world, their interests did not always align. But these tensions grew slowly, like the gradual tightening of a rope rather than a sudden pull. The early conflicts were not wars in the dramatic sense, but gentle frictions, tolls imposed, rights contested, harbours restricted, and taxes shifted with the tides of royal politics. To understand this delicate balance, imagine the northern seas again, seen from the deck of a merchant cog sailing between the coasts of Germany and Scandinavia. The water is calm, a pale blue-grey stretching toward the horizon. Low cliffs and pine-covered headlands rise from the shore, their outlines softened by morning fog. Villages appear as small clusters of huts near the water's edge, smoke from their hearths drifting upward in thin, wavering threads. These waters, beautiful and quiet, were also the gateways to powerful kingdoms. Denmark, sitting at the entrance to the Baltic, was the first of these kingdoms to cast a long shadow over Hanseatic trade. Its position was enviable. The narrow sound between Helsingør and Helsingborg, where the Baltic meets the Kattegat, was a natural checkpoint. Any ship passing from the Baltic into the wider seas beyond had to slip through these narrow waters. Kings of Denmark understood the value of this geography, and in time, they began to impose tolls on the ships that passed through. To a Hanseatic merchant, the sound felt like a threshold. Sailors lowered their anchors in the still waters, waiting for officials to board. The creak of wooden hulls echoed across the channel. Coins changed hands. Records were kept in ledgers written with careful strokes. Sometimes the process was smooth. Sometimes it was frustrating. But always it was unavoidable. Denmark's kings did not necessarily see themselves as obstructing trade. Many believed they were simply exercising the rights of their crown. But to the Hansa, whose identity was rooted in free movement and fair laws, these tolls felt like a stone placed on a smooth path. Sweden, for its part, was less concerned with tolls and more with influence over its rich iron and copper mines inland. These precious resources flowed to the coast, where Hanseatic merchants often controlled the export rights. Swedish rulers saw both opportunity and limitation in this arrangement. They valued Hanseatic expertise, ships and networks, but they also resented foreign control over their economic lifelines. The relationship between Sweden and the Hansa became a quiet dance of cooperation and rivalry. Contracts were negotiated. Privileges were granted and taken back. Town councils and royal messengers exchanged letters written in polite but cautious language. Norway, rugged and mountainous, was shaped by different concerns. Its coastlines stretched endlessly, broken by fjords that opened into deep, sheltered harbours. Fishing dominated its economy, especially stockfish, the dried cod that fed much of northern Europe. Hanseatic merchants were essential in moving this product across the continent, and for many years Norway relied heavily on them. But dependency often breeds discomfort. Norwegian kings occasionally sought to assert more control over their markets, trying to balance the prosperity brought by Hanseatic trade with the worry that foreign merchants wielded too much influence in their ports. Yet even as these tensions simmered, daily life went on. Hanseatic traders still walked the wooden piers of Bergen, their boots thudding softly on the planks as they carried ledgers beneath their arms. Danish fishermen still sold their catch to German merchants with firm handshakes and quiet conversation. Swedish miners still watched as their metal was weighed, inspected, and loaded onto cogs bound for distant towns. Most days, the rivalries were not felt at all. They lived in unseen places, in royal councils, in drafted treaties, in whispered suggestions from advisors. On the open water, life carried on much as before, gentle waves against the hull, the distant silhouette of coastal mountains, the steady pull of the wind in the sail. These quiet tensions did not weaken the League during its golden age. In some ways, they shaped it, forcing merchants to negotiate, to adapt, to communicate more clearly with rulers whose cooperation they needed. The Hansa was not a kingdom, and so it had no armies to command respect. But it had something just as powerful: economic influence. And though kings occasionally tested the boundaries of that influence, they did so with caution. A blocked harbour meant lost revenue. A failed negotiation meant stalled exports. A mistreated merchant could lead to a ripple of complaints felt all across the northern world. So the League and the Scandinavian kingdoms lived side by side, sharing the same seas, the same winds, and the same vulnerabilities. Their rivalries were real, but they remained muted, shadows cast by competing ambitions rather than open conflict. For now, the waters stayed calm. The merchants sailed undisturbed, and the life of the League continued to grow. But in time, these quiet disputes would gather weight. They would pull threads from the fabric of Hanseatic unity, and one day they would surface in the form of open confrontation. For now, though, the sea remained gentle, and the story continued to unfold. For all the quiet unity that bound the Hanseatic League together, there remained a truth that every merchant understood. An alliance of dozens of towns could not endure without a place to speak, to negotiate, and to decide. The League had no throne, no crown, no single ruler to command its will. Instead, it relied on something far more humble: meetings held in quiet halls, where merchants gathered not as subjects, but as equals. These meetings were known as Hanseatic Diets. They did not resemble the royal courts of Europe, where velvet draperies hung from gilded walls and kings pronounced decrees from elevated benches. The diets were simpler, quieter, shaped by the practical minds of traders who valued clarity over ceremony. Held most often in Lubeck, the city at the League's centre, they served as the beating mind behind the sprawling maritime network. Imagine travelling to Lubeck in the weeks before a diet. Caravans approached from inland roads, carrying town representatives and their clerks. Ships entered the harbour flying the insignias of distant cities: the white and red of Hamburg, the crowned griffin of Danzig, the keys of Rostock. As each delegation arrived, the city seemed to grow more focused, its mood shifting subtly toward contemplation and purpose. When the day of the diet began, delegates gathered inside a large hall, perhaps one belonging to a powerful guild, or a municipal building warmed by tall windows and heavy beams of oak. The air smelled of parchment, wax, and the faint traces of ink that clung to the robes of the clerks. Sunlight crept across the wooden floor in long, quiet patches. Outside, the life of Lubeck continued, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the cry of a gull circling the harbour. But inside, a steady calm settled over the hall. The merchants sat along long wooden benches. They were not nobles dressed in finery, but practical men in woolen cloaks and sturdy boots. Their faces bore the weathered look of those who had spent years among cargo holds and cold winds. They carried no swords, only scrolls, wax seals, and the knowledge of their town's needs. A diet unfolded in a predictable, measured rhythm. The presiding officers opened with a recitation of the matters at hand: a dispute over trade privileges in a foreign city, a request for military aid from one member town, a disagreement between guilds, or a proposal to standardize weights or contracts across new ports. Each topic was discussed with patience. Delegates spoke in calm voices, addressing one another with respect, even when their interests diverged. A representative from Rival might voice concerns about rising tolls in Scandinavia. A merchant from Hamburg might present the difficulties of navigating the North Sea during a particularly harsh winter. Another from Danzig might relay news of unrest in Poland or shifting grain prices along the Vistula. There were no shouted arguments, no dramatic declarations. The power of the Diet lay in its steadiness, its ability to distill dozens of local concerns into a collective response that benefited the League as a whole. Clerks recorded the proceedings on thick sheets of parchment, dipping their quills into ink with the soft rhythmic gestures of practiced hands. Wax seals were prepared. Decisions were written into formal resolutions, then copied and sent to the towns that depended on them. Through these documents, the Diet's choices echoed across the Baltic, reaching the quiet harbours of Finland, the wide estuaries of Prussia, the river markets of Poland, and the bustling streets of London or Bruges. The topics varied from year to year, but one theme remained constant: protection of trade. If pirates grew bold in a particular stretch of sea, the Diet organised collective defences. If a king raised tariffs unfairly, the League negotiated as a united front. If a town failed to uphold Hanseatic law, it faced consequences, sometimes the withdrawal of privileges, sometimes the loss of shared trust. And yet, even in their deliberations, the delegates understood that the League's strength was not born from punishment or dominance. It came from cooperation. Each town protected the others because their futures were intertwined, as inseparable as the knots that held the sails of their ships in place. When the day's business ended, the hall gradually emptied. Delegates stepped into Lubeck's evening streets, where the last colours of daylight softened into the cool blues of twilight. Some returned to their inns to write letters home by candlelight. Others walked to the harbour, gazing across the water where the silhouettes of anchored cogs drifted in the gentle current. There was a solemn satisfaction in knowing that, through discussion and patience, they had shaped the course of trade for cities they might never see, but felt connected to all the same. The Diets were not grand spectacles, and for that reason historians sometimes overlook them. But in truth, these quiet gatherings were the League's greatest innovation, a place where towns that might otherwise have been rivals became partners, and where merchants forged decisions that would guide the northern world for generations. And as these meetings continued year after year, the League grew more confident, more coordinated, and more prepared for the storms that waited beyond the horizon. Storms not of weather, but of politics. Storms that would test the unity they had built with such care. For many decades, the Hanseatic League and the Scandinavian kingdoms lived in a delicate balance. Their tensions rose and fell like the tides that shaped their shared seas. But no matter how carefully merchants negotiated or how patiently kings manoeuvred, there came moments when those tensions pulled too tightly. And in time, one such moment arrived, a moment that would draw the League into one of the most significant conflicts of its long history. Yet even this war began quietly. It did not erupt with sudden declarations or swift invasions. Instead, it grew slowly, like clouds gathering over the Baltic, darkening day by day until the storm could no longer be ignored. At the heart of the conflict was control. Control of the narrow waters that linked the Baltic to the wider world. Control of the tolls collected by the Danish crown. control of the routes that Hanseatic merchants relied upon to bring their goods to England, Flanders, and beyond. The kings of Denmark, seated securely in Copenhagen and Helsingør, understood the power of geography. The narrow Øresund, the Strait of Sound, was a gateway through which nearly every Hanseatic ship had to pass. To the Danish crown, it seemed only natural to turn this gateway into a source of revenue. To the merchants of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Danzig, it appeared less like a toll and more like a hand closing around the League's throat. Tension rose quietly. Letters were exchanged. Delegations travelled between courts. Merchants reported new restrictions, new fees, new delays at the Danish checkpoints. Still, the League preferred negotiation over confrontation. They debated the issue in their councils. They looked for compromise. They waited for the winds of diplomacy to shift in their favour. But Denmark had ambitions of its own. It sought to strengthen its position, to assert authority over the Baltic, and to remind the League that even the most powerful merchants remained guests in waters touched by royal law. And so, like the slow gathering of storm clouds, the conflict grew. When the first hostile actions occurred, they were modest. A Danish official detained a cargo ship longer than usual. A Hanseatic merchant refused to pay an increased toll. Small misunderstandings hardened into grievances. Grievances became anger. Eventually the tension broke. The League, guided by its councils, resolved that it could no longer allow Danish control to threaten the free flow of trade. For merchants who relied on steady winds, predictable laws, and safe passage, the uncertainty became untenable. Yet even then, the war did not resemble the grand clashes described in epic chronicles. No massive armies marched across Europe. No vast fleets filled the horizon with the thunder of battle. Instead, the conflict unfolded in the careful, deliberate style that defined the Hanseatic world. Convoys of merchant ships began to travel under collective protection. Armoured crews accompanied cargo vessels through dangerous waters. Occasional skirmishes broke the silence of the sea, the clash of metal against wood echoing across the waves. But these were moments, not spectacles. Much of the struggle took place in negotiations, blockades, and slow exertions of pressure. The League sought not glory, but stability. Their aim was not to conquer Denmark, but to compel its rulers to respect the needs of northern trade. The most famous moment of the conflict came at Helsingborg, a fortress poised on the Swedish shore opposite Helsingør. Its towers overlooked the Sound, watching every ship that passed. During the height of the conflict, Hanseatic forces supported Sweden against Denmark, and for a time the fortress changed hands. But even then, the atmosphere was muted compared to the grand battles of southern Europe. Ships approached cautiously. Sieges unfolded slowly. The quiet determination of merchants replaced the sweeping ambition of kings. For sailors on the Baltic, the war was a series of long days spent waiting for safe winds, waiting for news from nearby ports, waiting for the uncertainty to lift. Many nights, ships anchored just out of sight of the Danish coast, their lanterns trembling in the wind as crews whispered about politics they could not control. And then, just as it had begun, the storm began to pass. Denmark, pressured on multiple fronts, agreed to new terms. Tolls were regulated, rights were restored. The League regained the stability it sought. There were no triumphant parades, no grand celebrations, only a return to calm seas and reliable routes, which, to the merchants of the Hansa, meant everything. The war with Denmark did not elevate the League into a military power. Instead, it reminded the northern world that stability had a price, and that even the quietest empire must sometimes defend its right to exist. When the waters of the Baltic finally grew calm again, the League returned to what it knew best: measuring grain, counting barrels, watching the horizon. But beneath that calm lay a growing awareness that the world was changing, and that the League would one day face challenges much greater than tolls and contested straits. For now, however, the tides settled, and the seas grew gentle once more. As the Baltic Sea gradually returned to calm after its brush with conflict, the Hanseatic towns settled once more into their familiar rhythm of trade, routine, and quiet prosperity. But beneath the surface of commerce lay something deeper, a culture shaped by centuries of contact across the northern world. A culture built not by warriors or nobles, but by merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and families whose lives wove together into a rich and enduring tapestry. To understand the essence of the Hanseatic League, you must walk through one of its towns not with the eyes of a trader, but with the gaze of an observer drifting gently through its streets, noticing the places where daily life and artistry met. Imagine entering a Hanseatic city at dusk, perhaps Lübeck or Rostock or Stralsund. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of the sea mixed with the earthy smell of timber. Lanterns flicker to life along the streets, their warm glow splashing across stone walls and red brick facades. The city feels calm now, its bustle softening as workshops close and markets empty. The architecture of these towns speaks before any inhabitant does. Tall, narrow townhouses stand shoulder to shoulder, their gabled fronts rising in elegant steps toward the evening sky, built from red brick, the signature material of the Baltic. They form a distinct style known today as brick Gothic, an architectural language shared across the coastal world. Their windows are slender and arched, their facades decorated with simple patterns that catch the light at sunrise and sunset. These buildings, practical yet beautiful, reveal something essential about the Hansa: a love of craftsmanship, a respect for durability, and an appreciation for understated elegance. Walk further, toward the centre of town, and you reach the great churches, towering structures of tall brick spires and intricate vaults. Inside, the air cools, quiet and still. Candles burn in clusters, their flames trembling a little in the draughts that drift through the aisles. The nave rises magnificently, a vaulted canopy of arches that seem to stretch into infinity. Light filters through stained glass in soft shades, illuminating stone floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Though the Hansa was secular in purpose, faith was ever present. Church bells regulated the hours. Monks copied manuscripts in quiet chambers. Families gathered on Sundays, listening to sermons that echoed softly beneath vaulted ceilings. The patron saint of sailors and merchants, St. Nicholas, stood watching from carved altars, his presence a gentle reminder that even the bravest mariners relied on something beyond their own skill when they set sail across uncertain waters. Outside the churches, the life of the town took on warmer tones. Taverns served thick soups, roasted meats, and ale brewed in nearby guild houses. Fishermen repaired their nets by lantern light. Apprentices swept the thresholds of workshops as their masters counted coins and closed their shutters. The soft murmur of evening conversation drifted from windows and doorways as families gathered around their hearths. Music, simple and heartfelt, echoed through the quieter streets. A travelling musician plucked a lute. A group of children sang in a distant courtyard. The sounds blended with the whispers of the sea breeze moving through the alleys. And if you looked closely at the city's walls, the carvings above its doors, the symbols etched into its gatehouses, you would see a world shaped by both local traditions and far-reaching influences. Amber jewellery from the Baltic coast glowed in warm hues. Fine woolen cloth from Flanders hung in merchants' homes. Eastern icons from Novgorod found their way into churches and private chapels. Ceramics, glassware, and metalwork bore hints of distant lands. The Hanseatic League, though northern at its core, absorbed the colours, textures, and flavours of every culture with which it traded. Not through forced assimilation, but through gentle exchange. The quiet diffusion that occurs when people meet, converse, and learn from one another. Festivals brought this blending to life. In the summer months, market fairs drew travellers from across the region. Streets filled with stalls selling honey cakes, spiced wine, carved wooden toys, and embroidered cloth. Jugglers performed in the squares. Sailors from different coasts swapped stories under the soft glow of lamps. Children chased each other through crowds with wild laughter, while merchants lingered near stalls, examining foreign goods with curiosity and admiration. Winter festivals had a different feel, more intimate, more introspective. Snow covered the rooftops, muting the sound of footsteps on the streets. Markets wrapped themselves in evergreen boughs and pine-scented garlands. In homes, candles shone from windowsills, casting long beams of light onto the snow outside. In these moments, one could feel the heartbeat of the Hanseatic world, a rhythm set by the turning of the seasons, the steady work of artisans, and the quiet pride of a people who had built something lasting through the simple miracle of cooperation. Art and architecture, faith and festival, community and craft, all of it grew from the prosperity that trade provided. But more deeply, it grew from the sense of identity shared by towns separated by hundreds of miles yet united by the sea. This cultural richness would endure long after wealth and political influence began to fade. But for now, in the League's golden age, it flourished in every corner of every town, a testament to what people can create when stability and opportunity walk hand in hand. For every age of prosperity, there comes a moment, quiet at first, when the world begins to shift underfoot. A moment when familiar rhythms continue, yet subtle signs hint that something is changing. For the Hanseatic League, this moment arrived not with sudden catastrophe, but with the faint reshaping of horizons far beyond the Baltic Sea. It began with whispers carried by sailors returning from distant ports, rumours of voyages that ventured farther west than any Hanseatic ship had ever sailed, stories of coastlines no merchant had charted, and seas no fisherman had crossed. News of kingdoms, Portugal, Spain, and later England, and the Netherlands, sending bold expeditions toward lands unknown to European maps. To the merchants of Lubeck and Hamburg, these tales felt distant, almost unreal. Their world was the Baltic, its calm estuaries, its familiar harbours, its predictable winds. Yet even as they continued to load grain into warehouses or tally accounts in candle-lit rooms, the balance of global commerce was beginning to tilt. The discovery of sea routes that led beyond Europe, beyond Africa, and eventually around the globe, reshaped the map of opportunity. Trade, once centred around the narrow waters of the North and Baltic Seas, began to breathe outward, expanding toward oceans rich in spices, precious metals, exotic goods, and new sources of wealth. The Hanseatic League did not decline because it faltered. It declined because the world grew larger. Imagine a Hanseatic port in the early 1500s. The town looks much as it always has, church towers rising above rooftops, merchants conferring in the shade of guild halls, ships bobbing gently at their moorings. Life feels steady, predictable, deeply rooted, and yet, in the far-off markets of Antwerp, Lisbon, and Seville, ships with taller masts and deeper hulls are pushing into new waters. Goods once scarce and precious begin arriving from places beyond imagination. Pepper from India, silver from the Americas, silks and porcelain carried by caravans that stretched across deserts and mountains. Over time, these luxuries reach even the northern ports, dazzling merchants accustomed to more modest commodities. And with these changes comes competition. Dutch and English merchants, armed with larger fleets and ambitious ideas, begin to dominate the open seas. Their ships are faster, their trade networks more flexible, and their reach extends far beyond the limits of the Baltic world. They establish companies, formal, royal-backed institutions that operate with a scale and purpose unimaginable in the early Hanseatic days. Against such sweeping transformations, the League's older structures begin to feel still. Not weak, not broken, but steady in a world that has started to turn more quickly. New trade routes bypass the Baltic altogether. Southern ports rise in prominence. The wealth of entire nations becomes tied to global ventures rather than regional exchange. And yet, in the Hanseatic towns, the change is not immediately visible. Daily life continues. Ships unload barrels. Craftsmen work their looms. Children play among the narrow streets. The League's towns remain prosperous, comfortable, and confident. But beneath this familiar surface lies a growing sense of distance between the old world and the new. Meanwhile, political landscapes shift. Strong monarchies begin consolidating power. Denmark, Sweden, Poland, Lithuania. Kings seek to centralize authority over towns that once acted with broad independence. Royal policies influence trade more directly than before, constraining the autonomy that allowed the League to flourish. Even the nature of warfare changes. Gunpowder, cannons, and professional armies reshape the cost and scale of conflict. The Hansa, built on diplomacy and economic leverage, finds itself unprepared for these new tides. Still, the decline is gentle at first. Nothing collapses. No towns fall to ruin. No sudden crisis sweeps across the Baltic. Instead, the League's influence thins like mist, drifting from the surface of a warming sea. Slowly, softly, almost imperceptibly, merchants begin to notice that their markets are shrinking. Guilds find their authority challenged by stronger state institutions. Foreign traders appear with goods the League cannot match, sailing routes the League never sought to chart. The League, once a pioneer of northern commerce, becomes a guardian of an older way, honourable, structured, deeply rooted in tradition, but increasingly overshadowed by forces beyond its reach. And yet, even as the currents of history begin to pull the world in new directions, the Hanseatic towns endure. They continue to stand proudly along their ancient harbours, their red brick churches rising above the sea, their markets filled with familiar voices. The decline has begun, yes, but it begins with a whisper, not a storm. And for generations to come, the League will continue to adjust, adapt, and navigate the changing tides, moving slowly toward the long sunset of its age. As the 16th century took shape, the Hanseatic League found itself standing in a world both familiar and subtly transformed. Its ships still moored in bustling harbours, its merchants still gathered in guild halls, and its towns still echoed with the same timeless rhythm of trade and community. Yet beneath this continuity lay a quiet shift, a slow, steady fading of the influence that had once stretched boldly across the northern seas. The decline of the League was not a sudden fall, but a long sunset. A sunset that lingered across generations, soft and unhurried, casting warm, nostalgic light over the towns that had built their lives around the sea. In this era, the League's great cities each took their own path into the changing world. Lubeck, once the undisputed heart of northern commerce, remained proud and dignified. Its brick towers stood as confidently as ever, their silhouettes rising above the Trave River with quiet authority. The old laws still guided its councils. The merchants still gathered in the shadow of St. Mary's Church to discuss the affairs of trade. But the energy that once pulled distant towns into Lubeck's orbit now began to drift in new directions. Trade no longer depended on the Baltic alone, and global routes offered opportunities far beyond Lubeck's reach. Still, the city endured, not as a fallen power, but as a steadfast one, content to shine more gently than before. Hamburg adapted with subtle grace. Its river, the Elbe, carried it toward the North Sea and the new maritime world that was emerging there. While Lubeck looked inward, Hamburg looked outward, embracing the winds of change. Larger ships docked at its expanding quays. Merchants experimented with new partnerships, new markets, new routes. The city grew steadily, not through the strength of the old league, but through the quiet resilience of its own citizens. On the far side of the Baltic, Danzig, known today as Gdansk, flourished even as the league dimmed. Its wealth in grain exports bound it closely to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and its thriving shipyards echoed with the steady pulse of hammers and saws. Danzig learned to stand on its own, its connection to the Hansa becoming more symbolic than practical. The town's architecture, its guilds, and its maritime traditions remained deeply Hanseatic, but its political future took a different course. Further north, Reval, Riga, and other Baltic towns found themselves drawn into the rising powers of Sweden and Russia. Their harbours remained busy, but their autonomy softened under new royal influences. The sturdy walls of Reval still watched over the cold waters of the Gulf of Finland, but the flags that fluttered above those walls began to change. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the League continued to meet, to write letters, to negotiate trade rights, and to uphold old agreements. The Hanseatic Diets still convened, though their deliberations grew quieter, their influence more localized. Some towns sent fewer representatives, others drifted away entirely, their interests better served by new political and economic realities. And yet, nobody declared the League dead. There was no moment of finality, no solemn ceremony marking its end. Instead, the League simply softened, its presence fading like echoes from a distant harbour after nightfall. In these centuries, the world itself was changing in ways no medieval merchant could have imagined. Nations rose and fell with increasing speed. Oceans that once seemed like distant mysteries became highways of global trade. Wealth shifted to the great powers of the Atlantic. Competing companies, Dutch, English, Portuguese, charted new maps, sought new horizons, and built structures of commerce on a scale the Hansa never attempted. The League remained rooted in its traditions, its careful deliberations, its modest ships, its deeply local approach to trade. These traditions had made it strong in earlier centuries, but in a world now turned outward, they felt both comforting and limiting. Still, the Hanseatic towns maintained a sense of dignity and identity. In Lubeck, the bells continued to mark the passing hours. In Hamburg, warehouses filled with goods from inland farms. In Danzig, the grain cranes groaned softly over the river. In Riga, traders gathered in taverns beneath heavy beams darkened by centuries of smoke. Life went on, and there was something almost poetic about this long twilight. The League did not collapse. It simply grew quieter, its voice blending into the hum of a world in motion. Historians sometimes speak of decline as loss. But in the case of the Hanseatic League, the decline felt more like transformation, a gradual handing over of the world to new generations, new routes, new ideas. The League retreated gently from the stage, but the foundations it laid, the laws, the markets, the towns, the rhythms of commerce, endured far beyond its political influence. By the end of the 17th century, the Hansa was a shadow of its former self, but its towns remained prosperous, its legacy remained intact, and the sea, which had carried its ambitions for so many centuries, continued to wash calmly against the same ancient shores. The story of the Hanseatic League was not over. Not yet. But its brightest chapters had passed, and what remained was a soft, dignified afterglow, a twilight that would linger for a long time before the final night arrived. Even after the Hanseatic League's influence had softened into twilight, Its presence lingered in the towns that had grown under its guidance. The League was no longer the force it had been in its golden age, yet its spirit, its way of viewing commerce, community, and cooperation, continued to ripple quietly through the centuries that followed. In this way, the Hansa never truly disappeared. It simply slipped into the background of history, becoming part of the northern world's identity. Imagine walking through a former Hanseatic town in the early 18th century. The tall brick churches still dominate the skyline. The warehouses still line the harbours, their wooden beams darkened by age. The merchants' houses still stand shoulder to shoulder along cobblestone streets. From a distance, little seems changed. The League itself may have faded, but the world it created lived on. In Lubeck, the old laws continued to shape the city's governance long after the League had lost its broader authority. The council still met beneath the high arches of the town hall, its walls decorated with coats of arms representing centuries of civic pride. The merchants who walked those halls no longer commanded international trade, but they inherited a tradition of independence and careful negotiation that defined the city's identity. In Hamburg, the influence was even more profound. Its harbour grew steadily, adapting to new technologies and new maritime demands. By embracing the currents of the expanding world, Hamburg transformed into one of Europe's great ports, a thriving hub of global commerce shaped by the same maritime sensibilities that once made the League strong. The cautious, meticulous habits of Hanseatic traders lived on in the city's shipping companies, its merchant families, and even its municipal flag. Further east, in Danzig, the red brick facades that once welcomed cogs continued to stand proudly along the Motwawa River. Traders still crossed its bridges, and its vast granaries remained symbols of centuries of prosperity. Though the city shifted under new nations and new rulers, its Hanseatic identity endured in its architecture and its old mercantile families, who remembered the days when Danzig was one of the great pillars of northern trade. Riga, Tallinn, Stralsund, Wismar, Bremen, and dozens of other towns shared similar stories. The League may have receded from political importance, but the patterns it created, the urban layouts, the trade customs, the civic institutions, remained woven into the very structure of the cities. Brick Gothic architecture, with its stepped gables and intricate facades, became a defining characteristic of the entire region, turning the Baltic coast into a gallery of red stone and quiet elegance. Streets still carried names that spoke of merchants, shipbuilders, guilds, and long-forgotten markets. Old warehouses, once filled with wax, timber, and grain, found new life as workshops, museums, or private homes. The spirit of craftsmanship endured. Even the idea of merchant cooperation, once central to Hanseatic power, survived in subtle forms, in trading companies, in municipal councils, in chambers of commerce that echoed the purpose of the old guilds. The League's legacy influenced how northern cities governed themselves, valuing collaboration, negotiation, and fairness over force. Across the Baltic, cultural traditions preserved the memory of the Hansa. Folk songs, local legends, and archival records kept the stories alive. Many towns held yearly markets or festivals, recalling the days when merchant stalls crowded the cobblestones and ships from far-off shores brought news of distant lands. And the sea itself, the calm, grey Baltic, remained unchanged. Its tides washed softly against the same shores. Its winds carried the same quiet whisper through the masts of modern ships. The outlines of old trade routes could still be sensed, faint and ghost-like, beneath the surface of time. In the modern era, the word Hanseatic found new life. Cities sought to reclaim the pride of their heritage, adding Hanseatic City to their official titles. Sports clubs adopted the term, their names echoing centuries of maritime culture. In 1980, the new Hanseatic League, the Neue Hansa, was founded, connecting modern cities in a symbolic continuation of the old unity. Though ceremonial, it reflected an enduring desire to honour the cooperative spirit that had once bound dozens of towns across the sea. For travellers today, wandering through a Hanseatic city feels like stepping into a living museum. The brick towers, the narrow lanes, the old warehouses all stand as quiet reminders of a world where commerce shaped not only wealth, but community and culture. The creak of boats in the harbour still echoes the rhythm of centuries-old cogs. The smell of salt and timber lingers faintly in the air, and in the stillness of evening, when the lights reflect softly on the water, it is easy to imagine the silhouettes of medieval ships drifting gently into port after long journeys. The Hanseatic League may have faded from power, but its fingerprints remain everywhere along the Baltic and North Sea coasts. In architecture, in law, in trade, in civic identity, in the quiet pride of the towns that once belonged to it. Its story is one of endurance, not the endurance of dominance, but the endurance of influence. A reminder that history's greatest legacies are not always carved in stone or written in crowns, but grown in the everyday lives of ordinary people, carried forward across time by the gentle persistence of culture. The sun had set on the League's political power, but in its long afterglow, a softer light remained, warm, subtle, and unmistakably Hanseatic. As our journey through the world of the Hanseatic League draws to a close, it helps to return once more to the sea. The same sea that shaped its birth, carried its ships, and heard its final quiet farewell. For it is the Baltic itself, calm and grey in the early morning light, that best holds the memory of a league built not from conquest or kingship, but from the gentle strength of cooperation. Imagine standing on a quiet shoreline long after the heyday of the Hansa has passed. The wind moves softly across the water. The tide rises and retreats in its timeless rhythm. Seabirds circle lazily above the harbour, their wings catching glimmers of fading sunlight. And beyond the distant curve of the horizon, where the world feels wide and open, lie the old routes once travelled by merchant cogs. The cities that formed the League's backbone still stand today, their towers rising with quiet dignity above streets worn smooth by centuries. Lubeck's red brick spires still glow in the afternoon sun. Hamburg's harbour still hums with ships from around the world. Danzig's waterfront still reflects the same golden light it once offered to returning sailors. And in Tallinn and Riga, the old city walls continue to watch over the sea, guarding stories older than memory. If you walk through any of these towns at dusk, you may feel the faint echoes of the League. The architecture holds its imprint. The street names hold its whispers. The layout of markets and harbours holds its quiet logic. The sense of order and independence, the gentle rhythm that shaped life there, lingers like the scent of salt carried inland by an evening breeze. And somewhere in these echoes lies the reason the Hanseatic League remains so remarkable. It succeeded not through force, but through understanding, not through conquest, but through careful balance, not through domination, but through the shared belief that cooperation could achieve what individual ambition could not. The Hansa was a reminder of how powerful a community can become when it trusts in fairness, when it builds systems rather than walls, when it values stability over glory. Its merchants were not warriors, yet they shaped entire regions. Its councils drafted no imperial decrees, yet their decisions guided nations. Its ships carried no banners of conquest, yet they connected people in ways that altered the course of Northern Europe. This quiet strength is perhaps the League's most enduring legacy. A legacy felt not in proclamations or battles, but in the gentle persistence of its ideas, that commerce thrives where trust exists, that harmony grows where communities cooperate, and that even the smallest ports can shape the destiny of a region when they move forward together. As night settles over the Baltic, the sea grows darker, turning from grey to deep blue beneath the fading sky. Lanterns flicker to life along the waterfronts of ancient towns. Their reflections tremble in the water, stretching and shifting with the movement of the tide. Somewhere, faintly, you can imagine the soft creak of timber, the sound of a cog drifting slowly into harbour, guided by a steady breeze, and the simple hope of a safe return. The Hanseatic League may no longer command the trade routes it once did, but its story remains, carried across generations, like the murmur of waves against a quiet quay. In the architecture of its cities, in the traditions of its people, and in the very concept of cooperation that shaped its world, the League lives on. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its legacy. Not the height of its power, but the gentleness of its endurance. The sea, ever patient, remembers it. The cities, ever watchful, embody it. And the quiet power of its story continues to drift through time, soft as the evening tide, steady as the lantern's glow on water, enduring, even now. Thank you for joining this journey across the centuries and the seas, and for wandering, for a little while, through the world of the Hanseatic League.